some flying saucers that are of the devil, and there's some that are of the Lord. They overlook the fact that there's some of the Lord and try to put them all to those of the devil. The reason why is because there have been some flying saucers that they've reported abducted people, perform some kind of experiments, cut up animals, and do all kinds of things that would make people believe it's of the devil. So we don't deny that. And the reason why this phenomenon is happening in the latter days is because of the fact that the devil always creates a counterfeit before the true comes. He does that because he knows the scriptures better than we know. He knows what they point to. And so he makes his counterfeit first. Why? Because you see, the flying saucer will be used by God's people during the time of the loud cry to finish the gospel. After all, how do we finish the gospel, cut it short in righteousness, in Romans 9:28, if we have some kind of help? And I'm going to show you why. Because during the time of the loud cry of the scarlet-colored beast, when the man 666 makes a decree that you cannot buy or sell without the mark, and the saints will not take the mark, then how are they going to buy a car, rent a car, lease a car, fly on an airplane, on a train, on a bus, unless they take the mark? How are we going to finish the gospel like that? Furthermore, they travel too slow. The flying saucers are very fast and go anywhere. And we find that that's how God is going to finish the work, cut it short in righteousness. So we're going to take a look in the scriptures and find that there are good angels that God uses in the flying saucers, even the Lord himself. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 1, there in verse 4. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came, and out of the north a great cloud and a fire enfolding itself. And the fact that it said came, you can read that in 1 track, page 10, where he says the fact that it came shows it's traveling, it's moving. And it's traveling not on the land, or the whirlwind goes through the air, the cloud goes through the air. It's definitely showing some kind of movement that's traveling through the air. When you come to verse 26, he says he saw the likeness of a throne, and he saw the appearance of a man. Now you see, this is in vision because of the fact that he didn't say he saw a throne and a man. He said he saw the appearance of it, which indicates that this is a prophecy that he saw was yet future to take place. And when we read in verse 28 of Ezekiel 1, it says there, it was the glory of the Lord. This clearly indicates that this flying saucer, this traveling vehicle, is called cherubim or cherubims or chariot. It shows that they travel a lot faster than what man travels. When you read in verse 14, well, in 13 they're called living creatures, and in 14 these living creatures ran as a flash of lightning. That certainly cannot describe the type of vehicles that man has today. Now we want to notice that these flying saucers of the Lord is described at the time of the year 1844. We're going to find that out in the book of Daniel. Turning now to Daniel chapter 7, we see that in verse 8 we have the nondescript beast, and that nondescript beast, papal Rome, because verse 7 is also Rome, but it's pagan. Pagan Rome, verse 7, papal Rome, verse 8. And Daniel didn't understand about this, and he asked the angel to tell him, and the angel answers and said, verse 25, and told about this power of verse 8. That's the one he wanted to know. If you'll notice there in verse 17, well, in 16 he goes to those who stood by, and one of them told the interpretation of these things. In verse 17 he says there are 4 great beasts and kings and kingdoms of the world. And then in verse 19 he says, then I would know the truth of the fourth beast. Tell me about the fourth beast. Why? Well, you see, Daniel was familiar with Babylon. He was there in captivity in Babylon. He knew about maybe Persia and Grecia, which existed at that time. But he didn't know this one because it did not describe any particular thing he could equate with. And the angel of the Lord told him that he would to exist for 1260 years. We have here on the chart 538 to 1798. Well, you see, that's not the time element of pagan Rome. It started in 63 BC and fell in 476. So he's definitely describing the one that lasted for 1260 years, which is pagan Rome. Pagan Rome only lasted about 400 and some odd years. So it's this one, number 8, that he's telling him in verse 25. Now you notice at the end of this beast, in verse 8, we come to verse 9. There he says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and his throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. You see, the wheel shows it moves, and the fact that it travels through the air, as we found out, as a cloud, and as a whirlwind, Ezekiel 1:4. We see this is God's throne in the day of 1844, when the thrones were cast down, meaning they were set up for use, and the Ancient of Days did sit. Now that could not be in the holy apartment of the sanctuary in heaven, because according to the type of Moses' day, there was no throne in the first apartment. The throne was in the second apartment. This is telling us about the year 1844, when Jesus went in the heavenly sanctuary and the Father sat on the throne. And they went in there on their flying saucers. You notice down in verse 13, he saw one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. That is a description of something, a vehicle that travels like a cloud. Now we can read that here in Early Writings, page 54 and 55. And you notice that the title of it is The End of the 2300 Days. That's 1844.
What's that page for again?
54 and 55, Early Writings. So there, she says on 54, paragraph 2, I saw a throne, and on it sat the Father and the Son. Well, now what throne is that? The fact that the Father and the Son are sitting on it shows it's not a temporary throne, a permanent throne. It's the everlasting throne, and it's found in Revelation 22, verse 1. There, we'll stop and go to your Bible. Revelation 22, verse 1. This verse is one that is very important for understanding the subject and many other subjects, for it shows the Father and the Son on the eternal throne. And notice what it says. I saw a river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. Now, when you read there and see that both of them are sitting on the throne, and you read in Mark 16:19 about Jesus going to heaven. And let's see what it says. Mark 16:19. And on this chapter, it's in the last chapter, just before Jesus goes to heaven. And it says right there in Mark 16, and I'm going to read verse 19. Next to the last verse in the entire book of Mark, it says, So then after the Lord had spoken unto them, he was received up into heaven and sat on the right hand of God. Now you see, he did not sit in the sanctuary, because of the fact the sanctuary was not set up until 1844. We know it wasn't set up till then because it says the thrones were cast down, which means set up for use. They were not there before. When Jesus went up to heaven, it says he sat on the right hand of God. So he had to be sitting on the eternal throne Revelation 22, verse 1. That eternal throne is a stationary one, and it's separate from the ones that travel. Now, going back here to early writings, it says, before the throne, this is page 54, in the middle of that paragraph too, before the throne I saw the Advent people, the church and the world. Now, the fact that she saw the Advent people, who started with the doctrine of the Second Advent with William Miller, and that Seventh-day Adventists continued on with that doctrine, teaching the 2300-day prophecy, then it's clear that we're talking about the event in our day. And it's already identified by the fact that it says end of the 2300 days. When we come over to page 55 into paragraph 1, I saw the Father rise from the throne. Well, what throne? We've already identified this as the eternal throne where the Father and Son are sitting. So he saw the Father rise up from the eternal throne, from which the river of water of life flows, and in a flaming chariot, that's the flaming chariot, wheels like a fire, we read in in Daniel 7, verse 9. He gets into this traveling throne, and he goes into the Holy of Holies with the veil and sits down. Well, you see, in the Holy of Holies is where there's a throne. Not in the Holy, but in the Most Holy. So he goes in there and sits down. Now let's read about that. I'll hold my place here in Early Writings. We're going to go to Revelation chapter 4. Because John saw the same thing that Daniel saw, but John saw it in more greater detail. In Revelation chapter 4, John said, after this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. Now there are two doors in the sanctuary. There's a door into the holy, and there's doors in the most holy. When he saw a door, and it was opened, we have to know which door is that. And in verse 2, he said he beheld a throne. So it's very clear, since there's no throne in the holy, then that door had to be open into the most holy, where there is a throne. And there he saw the Father sitting, somebody sitting on that throne. And in verse 4, there were 24 seats. They were set up. That's the thrones that were cast down in Daniel 7:9. And in Daniel 7:10 it says, the books were opened. You notice here that in the Father's hand, in chapter 5, where he's sitting in verse 1, he either sat on the throne, had a book in his hand, and Jesus in verse 6, there stood a lamb, and in verse 7, he took the book out of the hand of him that sat on the throne. That's the book of life. He opens that book, and he goes through the book and makes the judgment, all whose names are there, to decide if they should be there or should be taken out. We call that the judgment of the dead, which began in the year 1844. Now, I can read about that here in Great Controversy, page 429, and there is a statement on 427 I can read. It says there, on 429, that the saints were to follow Christ by faith into the heavenly sanctuary. Because it says they were not. Now this is in the paragraph 1 on page 427 in the middle. They were not to be present in person at the marriage, for it takes place in heaven while they are on the earth. And it says they were to by faith go in there for God. That's the way we entered the heavenly sanctuary to this very day, is by faith. That's why we believe in the 2300-day doctrine. On page 429 at the bottom, but when the ministration in the first apartment ended, the ministration in the second apartment began. Well, it started when Jesus went to heaven. He became our high priest in Hebrews 8:1. And there, he officiated in the first apartment. In 1844, he officiated in the second apartment. And then at the bottom, page 429, but while it was true that that door of hope and mercy by which men had for 1,800 years found access to God were closed, 1,800 years shows that when Jesus went up in heaven, 1,800 years from that time, clear down to our day, and add 44 years to that 1,800, then you would have the time in which, well, you actually wouldn't add 44 because he didn't go to heaven until 31 AD. And then you would add 10 years to that, which would bring you at 1844.
10 years?
10 years. If you say he went to heaven in 31 AD, but the time element for the Jews did not end till the end of the 7 weeks, would be 34 AD. So you go from 34 AD to 1,800 years, would be 1834, and then you add the 10 years till you have 1844. And then she says, another door was opened. Another door was opened, and forgiveness of sins were offered to men through the intercession of Christ in the most. Now, going back here to early writings, we find that after the Father gets on his traveling throne and moves into the most holy and sits on the throne, then down further on page 55, then a clouded chariot with wheels like flaming fire surrounded by angels came to where Jesus was. He stepped in the chariot and was borne to the holiest where the Father sat. There I beheld Jesus, a great high priest, standing before the Father. Now, we can go here to this chart, and we can see there where it's describing the seals and the judgment. And there we see the Father on the throne in 1844 in the Most Holy. We see Jesus standing in front as a lamb. We see the four beasts who are not there in person but symbolized there. All those in that book right there. And we see this judgment scene here that took place in 1844. Now, the point we stress there is the fact that the Father and the Son have their own personal traveling thrones. And they do move in these flying